Okay. It did occur to me while we were worshiping as well that for those of you who may not know me, I did not introduce myself earlier. So I am Pastor Kathi. I'm one of the staff pastors here, and I just feel very privileged to be able to share with you this evening. So we're still in 1 Corinthians, and tonight we're going to be talking about being humble servants. And the first thing I wanted to tell you is a little story from a Mexico mission trip. This one was quite a while ago, and I know Lynn Miles is on this trip with me as well. But we were on a trip with 60-some people. That's probably the biggest trip I think we've taken, south to Mexico. We had 5 different churches involved. Now, that was a great experience, but when you get that many people together from that many churches, sometimes information can get lost somewhere along the way. Now, Lynn was leading that trip, and I know he did a great job of sending out the information, but how many of you know you have to actually read the information to know what's going on, right? You guys all read stuff. You're not some of those people that just deletes an email and doesn't take a look at it? Okay, so we're on this trip, and we had a gentleman who I'm going to call George. He was not from our trip, so don't look around and think, who was it? It's not anybody here. It was somebody from another church. And George did not look at the information that was sent out about the trip. All he knew was we were going to Mexico on a mission trip, and he had never been on one before, so he didn't have a really good idea of what this all entailed. George seemed to think at the beginning of the trip that this was a vacation to Mexico, not a work trip to Mexico. Much, much different. Now, those of you who've been on our trips, you know we do construction. It's hot, it's dirty, it's dusty, but it's fantastic. The people are so wonderful. And at that time, we were working at a Bible college in Juarez. So as an educator, a former educator, that was very exciting to me that we were working at a Bible college. George was not as excited as I was. And when we got to Juarez, Lynn had to go back to the airport to pick up somebody else whose plane had been delayed. And so the ladies who were in charge of setting up room assignments started gathering us all together, again, lots of people, and getting them divided up between who was going to be in which room together. And George was not happy because he thought he was getting his own personal room. And he was going to be in a room with 3 other people because we try to go as frugally as possible, so we always share rooms. George kind of threw a little bit of a fit. And he yelled at 2 of the ladies who were in charge of things and got some people really, really upset. Well, I know when Lynn got back from the airport, he said, "Get your stuff, I'll take you back to the airport and you can go home." And George kind of backed up and said, "No, I'd really like to stay." Okay, well, if you're going to stay, you have to do what the team is doing. I don't know if you guys can imagine, but keeping 60-some people all together going through Mexico at the same time can be a little challenging. The next thing that George was unhappy about was the food. Now, how many of you remember Norma Bartle? A few of you. Norma Bartle was one of the best cooks around, and George was unhappy with the food that Norma was cooking. I cannot understand that. Norma had lots of different choices. She had brought baked goods. She was fantastic, but George was very unhappy about the food that was being served. We got up too early. He wanted to sleep in. The weather was too hot. Everything you can think of, George was complaining about. So again, he'd signed up to go on a mission trip to be a servant, a humble servant, but he was acting like he was on vacation and this was all about him. He grumbled the entire week. He actually went to the hotel desk and went ahead and purchased his own room because he flat out refused to stay with anybody on the team. But God has a way of working on people's hearts when we're together like that. Those trips can be difficult, but also God gets our attention. And by the end of the week, when we had our last gathering, our last devotion together, George stood up and apologized to the entire team. God had finally gotten a hold of his heart. He'd allowed God to get a hold of his heart, and he realized that the attitude he'd had all week was not that of a humble servant. And I have to trust that George went on to maybe be a little bit more humble in all of the things that he was doing later on. I know that it was interesting from my perspective to see that about face, that change in him. And isn't that what the Lord does? Is he takes those rough parts of us and he wears them off and he causes us to change to be more like him. Serving the Lord is not about our preferences. That's kind of what George thought. This was all about him and what he wanted, but that's not what serving the Lord is about. The Lord wants us to enjoy serving. He wants us to be encouraged and happy in what we're doing, but he also wants us to learn to focus on him. And if we're focused right here on what we want, we really can't focus on him. We have to learn and practice being humble servants. Now, I know we all would probably love to say, well, yes, I am a humble servant, but we all know ourselves well enough to know there are times when we're selfish. There are times when we have too much pride. There are times when maybe we're tired or we don't feel good, and we start focusing on our personal wants and needs rather than what the Lord has. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight with the Corinthians. We are continuing again on our study of 1 Corinthians, and you have the selection there on your handout, or you can turn to 1 Corinthians. We're in chapter 4. Part of Paul's purpose of this letter was to talk to the Corinthians about the fact that they were in disunity, they weren't all together, and really they were being very immature. The main point in this particular chapter is that the Corinthians needed to have a correct perspective on church people, and really on themselves. Otherwise, they incorrectly assume that church is all about them, and they want to promote individual people. They want to promote individual giftings rather than the gospel. And church should be about promoting the gospel. Now, in my study, I came across a really interesting phrase. Paul goes into this selection, and they called it sanctified sarcasm. Sarcasm is not usually my favorite way to handle things or to get a message across, but at this point, Paul was very, very frustrated. He had been there, he had founded this church, he had taught them, he'd gone on to his next missionary journey, and they had kind of started to make it all about himself. And so he decides to become just a little bit sarcastic in this particular verse. So this is 1 Corinthians 4, 8 through 13. You have to hear a little bit of tone in this. Already you have what you want. Already you have become rich. Without us, you have become kings. And would that you did reign so we might share in the rule with you. For I think that God has exhibited us apostles as last of all, like men sentenced to death, because we have become a spectacle to the world, to angels and to men. We are fools for Christ's sake, but you are wise in Christ. We are weak, but you are strong. You are held in honor, but we in disrepute. To the present hour, we hunger and thirst. We're poorly dressed and buffeted and homeless, and we labor working with our own hands. When reviled, we bless. When persecuted, we endure. When slandered, we entreat. We have become and are still like the scum of the world, the refuse of all things. So last week when Pastor Lance was preaching, he was talking about them being proud. They were proud of who they associated with. They were proud of the things they'd been given. But we have to keep in mind that everything we're given comes from God. We don't get to be proud in and of ourselves for those things because those are gifts from the Lord. And he doesn't just give those to us to puff us up and make us more important. He gives those to us so we can in turn glorify him. But that's not what the Corinthians were doing. And just let me mention, he's talking to the Corinthians here, but isn't he also talking to us? These are things that describe us as well, especially in America. So, what he was pointing out is that the Corinthians had developed what they considered personal wisdom, superior knowledge, and superior spiritual gifts. So again, this is his sanctified sarcasm. Paul doesn't really think they're kings. He doesn't really think they're better. He's using sarcasm to get their attention. What he's really doing is pointing out their spiritual pride and their immaturity. They thought they had everything they needed already from God. They didn't need anything from Paul. They were above his directions. They were above his authority. But those who truly identify with Jesus often will end up following a path that includes some suffering and some hardship in order for God to be honored and glorified. Now, I don't think that any of us go, yay, we're going to have hardship and suffering. But we know that those things come, and we know we have a mighty God who walks through those things with us, and that he is going to use all things for his glory and his honor. We are called to walk through suffering differently than the world. If we walk through suffering the same way the world does, we're not allowing God to work in our hearts and our lives and change us. Romans 8:16-17, Paul mentions this. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him in order that we may also be glorified with him. We kind of like that we're children of God part, but sometimes we don't go far enough to remember that sometimes that means that we're going to suffer with him as well. Paul mentions here some symptoms that really describe a prideful church. I think it's a little sad that we have to admit that sometimes there are churches or any organization that's prideful, but I think it's wise for us to remember to look for these things and make sure that we're not falling into that trap, because it can be very easy to do without realizing it. So a prideful church, in that kind of environment, our faith really is about our self-fulfillment, our advancement. Our faith is so great that we get to do this. Our faith is so great that we can do that. That's what was happening in the Corinthian church. This man's faith is so strong that I'm following him when we're supposed to be following the Lord. The idea of what's in it for me becomes very important, and that's really immaturity. When we think about serving, we're not serving in the nursery because it does something for me. We're serving in the nursery because we're having a chance to minister to God's children. I'm not going on a mission trip because it's something for me. I'm going on a mission trip because I want to serve others, and I want the Lord to break something in me that needs to be broken, to humble me. Now, that doesn't mean that when I go on a mission trip, God doesn't pour back into me just as much as I give out, but we don't do it for that. We go because we want to serve the Lord, not because there's something in it for me. And in a prideful church, alliances begin to form. And this is what was happening in the Corinthian church. If you remember a few weeks ago, we were talking about, I follow Apollos and I follow Peter. They were identifying themselves with individual people rather than identifying themselves with the Lord. The Lord is who we have in common, not which person we follow. When alliances are formed, then you end up with division, disunity, which is exactly opposite of what we should have in our church. In verse 9, he starts to talk about suffering. Now, I think it's important to note here that he's talking about the suffering of the apostles, so he's not necessarily saying these are things that are going to happen to you as a follower of Christ. But we do know that we are going to sometimes be against the things of the world. We should be if we're following Christ, right? But here he's saying that the apostles were compared to men sentenced to death. Now, remember that the apostles were the people who were personally selected by Jesus to further the gospel and to start his church. He uses the word exhibited, and this really is referring to the battles of the gladiators in the Roman world. These were in amphitheaters filled with lots of people who were very eager to see the competition. Now, don't think American football. That is not what this is, because these were fights to the death. And it was sport for these people who were watching to watch someone be killed by the beast that may happen to be there or the other gladiators that were there. Now, the way this typically worked was in the morning. That's when they had the big fights. And they would send in gladiators and prisoners, and they gave them armor. So if they went in to fight a beast, they had armor to protect themselves. But in the afternoon, after the main event, they would then send in the poorest and the weakest prisoners with no armor at all. They sent them in knowing they really had very, very little chance of surviving that fight, but it was sport for them to watch. And those are the people that Paul is comparing the apostles to. They were the men sent in basically for slaughter with nothing to protect themselves. They were men appointed to die because it was very unlikely they would survive. So this is suggesting that God appointed the apostles to a life of adversity, inconvenience, and suffering to be seen by the world, by the angels, and the church in order for God's glory to be seen through them. Now, we have to remember the circumstances that Paul was in at the time of the writing of this letter. When Paul writes this letter to the Corinthians, he's in Ephesus. He's been on a missionary journey, and he's been in Ephesus for 3 years when he's gotten word that things are going awry in the Corinthian church. Now, during this time, he had lack of food, lack of drink, lack of proper clothing. He was despised. He was mistreated. He had no home. He worked hard day and night, and yet he's cursed, persecuted, and slandered and considered, as he said, the scum of the world, the refuse of all things. Just the fact that Paul was working with his hands would have been very distasteful to the Corinthians. They hated physical labor, and he's working to make tents. So they would have despised him. They would have despised what he was doing. Now, I don't know how much you guys know about the deaths of the apostles. It wasn't pretty. John is the only one that died a natural death, but the rest of them died from a variety of really horrific deaths, being crucified, some of them upside down, being beaten, stoned, beheaded, hung, burned alive, or run through with a sword, and for some of them, multiple of those things. So the apostles did die terrible, terrible deaths. But there are lessons we can learn in suffering. I think the first one is we learn in suffering not to rely on ourselves, but to rely on God. I don't know if any of you have ever been to that point where you have no place else to turn. Things in front of you are so bad, there's nothing you can do except cry out to the Lord. When we get to that point and God comes through, which he will, we know it's not us. It's not something I did. That's something God did. Self-reliance was the problem that the Corinthians had. And here, as they go through suffering, that's removing that self-reliance and forcing them to rely on God. 2 Corinthians 1, 8 through 11 says, "For we do not want you to be unaware, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia." And this is Paul talking. "For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despised of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death, but that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead." When we remember the things God has done in the past, whether it's in the Bible or whether it's for me personally, when we keep those things in mind, we have to walk forward in faith knowing that he will do those things again. He delivered us from such a deadly peril that he will deliver us. On him we have set our hope that he will deliver us again. You also must help us by prayer so that many will give thanks on our behalf for the blessing granted us through the prayers of many. Those stories are so important to remember, and those stories are so important to share. People need to know what God has done in the Bible. People need to know what God has done for you. May we always be bold enough to be able to say, "Look what God did for me here," because those stories speak to other people so strongly. Another thing that suffering will do is help our faith grow. Philippians 1, 12 through 14. "I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. So that has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear." We need to know those things so we can walk in boldness. And then when we go through suffering, God's power can be shown. 2 Corinthians 4, 7 through 9, "But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed." We will walk through difficulty, but we can walk through it with victory with the Lord. Paul goes on next to contrast pride and humility. So he's taking something that he uses to describe the Corinthians, and then he gives the opposite of that describes the apostles. In verses 7 through 9, he compares the Corinthians as kings and the apostles as prisoners. He's talking about their pride to living like kings. They weren't actually kings, but because they had gathered wealth, because they had power, because they had privilege, he felt that they were living like kings as the apostles were suffering, as other followers of Jesus were suffering. When we measure others by the world's standards, we are dead wrong. When we measure ourselves by the world's standards, again, wrong. We have to measure ourselves by God's standard. And it's so hard because, especially in the American world, we tend to think so much about ourselves. We have to be very intentional about knowing what the Word says and about following what the Lord is saying. Now, this is not saying that we can't recognize people who do a good job for the Lord. Faithful servants can be recognized and honored, but the key is, who are they giving credit to? If I'm being honored for something and I'm saying or thinking, oh, I did such a good job with this, that's the world. But if I'm saying, that's not me, that's God, that's giving credit to the Lord. And this is reflected in 1 Thessalonians 5:12 through 13. We ask you, brothers, to respect those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord, and admonish you to esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Be at peace among yourselves. That's not saying esteem them highly and make them big. It's saying because of their work in the Lord, esteem them. It's God in those people. Then he goes on to compare the Corinthians as wise men. Again, this is his sarcasm, to fools, the apostles. The Corinthians were wise in their own eyes. They thought they had it all figured out, but that really makes them, according to the word, fools in God's eyes. If we want to be spiritually wise, we really need to become a fool in the eyes of the world. I know when I was a teacher and I would take, for 18 years, I took my spring break to go on a mission trip. And there were people who were like, why do you do that? Why? I mean, I have friends going to the beach and I have friends going to the mountains, and they could not understand, why would anybody do that? We had college students who would go with us, and it was costly. The money cost a lot for them. College students, you guys are not rich, right? But they would take that time to go. They would pay that money to go because we were serving the Lord. People who don't know the Lord, people who don't love the Lord, do not understand why we want to serve him in that way. But I'd rather be foolish in front of them and wise in the Lord. 2 Corinthians 12:9, I think, supports this. Actually, I think I'm one ahead. 1 Corinthians 3:18, let no one deceive himself. If anyone among you thinks that he is wise in this age, let him become a fool, that he may become wise. So the Bible's telling us wisdom comes from the Lord. It doesn't come from my mind. It doesn't come from yours. It comes from the Lord. Next, he goes on to call them strong men compared to the weak. Through suffering, Paul had discovered this really important spiritual concept that spiritual strength is the result of personal weakness. And this is 2 Corinthians 12:9. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest on me. It's not about my strength. It's not about what I can do. It's about what I'll allow the Lord to do through me, his strength. Those times when I feel the weakest, those times when I feel like I'm not cut out to do something or I'm not well trained enough, those are the times that God can work through me in those situations. My weakness is his strength. Then he compares the Corinthians as honorable and the apostles as despised. The main problem with the Corinthian church is that they wanted the honor that came from men, not the honor that comes from God. Every motivation behind what they were doing was so they could have someone tell them, what a great job you're doing. Wow, I want to follow you because you are so fantastic. That's the wrong motive. Paul is telling them that if they wanted to associate with the apostles, if they want to be associated with the mighty God, They need to be ready for suffering because the world is not going to accept what we're doing when we're serving the Lord. And then this is so interesting. Paul goes through a section where he's telling us, how do you respond to poor treatment? This is very challenging for me because it is so opposite of our culture. I want to be able to respond in these ways, but I can't do this in my own strength. If I'm not connected to the Lord, if I'm not listening to him, if I'm not following him, these are going to be things that are hard to do. So he says, when we are reviled, we bless people. So when people hate us, we're going to bless them. When persecuted, we endure. And when slandered, we entreat. Now, if that's a word that that's not a very common word in our vocabulary necessarily, but what he's saying there is praying earnestly. So when someone slanders me, my natural human reaction is, well, let me tell you why you're wrong. Let me stand up for myself. But Paul's saying, pray earnestly for them. We have to have that opposite reaction to what may be natural to us. So we want to become humble servants. The greatest example of a humble servant, guesses? Jesus, sure. To some who were confident in their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else, Jesus told this parable. This is from Luke 18. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, thank you, I am not like the other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all I get. Kind of puffed up, right? But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift his eyes to heaven. But he beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Be merciful to me, a sinner. And Jesus says, I tell you, this man, the tax collector, went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. You see, the Pharisee was just checking boxes. He had a list of things that he had to do. And he's, okay, I did that, I did this, I'm tithing, I'm fasting. He was not doing things with the right heart. And so he was just trying to make sure that he'd done the things he needed to do so he'd be okay with the Lord. How many of us had heard that from people before? I'm okay with the big guy upstairs. That's not the way that it works. The way that it works is even if we have done, through God's help, great things, we are still sinners. And we still have to ask him for his mercy. So regardless of who I might look like, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. So our perspective on humility can be radically changed if we study the life of Jesus. You see, sometimes we think that humility is saying, oh yeah, I'm just not any good at that, and putting ourselves down. That's not humility. Humility is knowing who we are in relation to God and who we are in relation to others. Jesus left heaven, and throughout his life on earth, he demonstrated humility, saying he came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life for a ransom for many. And on the last night with his disciples, besides serving the Lord's Supper, what did he do? He washed their feet. He washed their feet. Now, remember that this is a dusty, dry area where they're wearing sandals. So this is not like a clean little foot that's been in a sock. This is dusty, dusty feet. So, but what a humbling experience for not just Jesus, but for the apostles who were with him, the other disciples. And then, of course, his greatest example of humility is dying on the cross for us. He didn't deserve that. He did nothing to deserve that, but he did that for us. Humility can be our greatest friend. It increases our hunger for God's word. It opens our hearts to his spirit, and it leads to intimacy with God. Humility draws us closer to him. But we have to understand this does not happen overnight. It's not like you're going to go out of here tonight and say, I am now a humble servant, everything is going to be good. It doesn't work that way. It's kind of like an onion. You know, you peel one layer off of the onion, and it reveals another layer, and then you peel that layer off, and it reveals another layer. So we may, with God's help, work on an area in our lives that we need to be more humble, and he works a mighty miracle, and then we realize underneath that there's this other layer, and then this other layer. Or something comes at us that's difficult and we get frustrated and suddenly that humility is growing back again. It is a constant work. It is a work throughout all of our lives. We never get to the point where we are completely humble. We have to stay connected to the Lord. So it doesn't happen overnight. In order to have the right view of ourselves into relation to God and others, we have to really think about what that relationship is. So we are, on the one hand, we're God's creation. We're small. We're dependent. We're limited in intelligence. I know we're in a university town, but really, God knows more than we do, okay? We're limited in intelligence and ability. We're prone to sin, and we're soon to die and face God's judgment. So that's us in relation to him. But we're also God's children, created by him, loved by him, redeemed by his grace alone, gifted by God with certain gifts and abilities, resources, advantages, and we're to use those for his glory, not to build ourselves up. So as we depend on the Holy Spirit's help to humble ourselves, that humility grows in our souls. It's something we work on all of our lives. Now, on the back of your handout, go ahead and flip that over. I gave you some things to think about today as we move forward in prayer in just a few moments. There are 3 things I'd like you to ask the Lord to show you. First of all, blessings the Lord has given you. Because you see, it's really hard to be angry and prideful when we're being grateful for the things the Lord has given you. So I challenge you, see if you can write 3 or 5 things down there that were blessings to you. And then suffering that has built my faith. You may not want to write the whole sad story, but I know that in my marriage, we've gone through difficulty, and that's something that's built my faith. That's something I would write down, my marriage. So what things can you write down that you can see God has used to strengthen your faith? I don't ask for suffering, but I can see, looking back over my life, that there are things that God did, and I wouldn't have got close to him here if I had not gone through this thing over here. Now, we've recently had a grandchild, and it made me think of childbirth. You know, you have a mother who goes through the pain of childbirth, but she wouldn't not do that because of this beautiful child that God has given her afterwards. So there are things we go through, but there's a purpose, and God can use those things, even terrible things, he can use for his glory and his purposes. And then areas to release my way and be a humble servant. Pray that the Lord would speak to you. I know we all have areas that we need to work on. This is probably not a paper you want to take home and put on your refrigerator later on and tell your whole family about, but I think it's something that you keep in your Bible and you pray about. I want the Lord to reveal those things to me, and I want him to heal those things in me. I want him to strengthen my faith by removing those areas where I'm too prideful. So during our prayer time today, I'd like you to think through that. If you've got a pen or there's pens in the pew there, just jot some things down that the Lord is speaking to you that you want to remember. So if you guys will stand.